What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Design Over Time, and this time we're doing something a little unique, a little different, and I was running around the internet or stumbling across the internet. I'm not sure what the exact verb is, but I came across this video, and it's a guy talking about Bloodborne, and the video is about an hour and a half long, so, you know, I've watched the video about 2.5, 3 times now, but I really like this video. It's honest, it's funny, it's long, it's detailed, and it's made from this super spirited guy named H.Bomberguy. Anyway, the video is long, and as you might expect, it goes through a lot of design topics and examples. I want to show you, so like I watched the entire video, and I used the DO color topic wheel. I'll show you what that looks like right here. So I went through the entire video, and every time that H.Bomberguy went over a specific topic about game design, something that you can clearly see that's color-coded on this design-oriented topic wheel, I went ahead and dragged a color bar into a list. So the whole hour and 30 long video, arranged by topics, looks a little bit like this, and I'll show you right here. So yeah, ton of topics. Spent a ton of time talking, and I think what's interesting is I pretty much disagree with most of his major arguments. And, you know, why I think that's interesting is he did such a good job communicating, such a good job framing his arguments and articulating his thoughts that the video is highly successful at letting us know what he thinks. And even if it doesn't align perfectly with your experiences playing Bloodborne, your experiences playing these different kinds of games or games in general or whatever, at least we can see where he's coming from. So my idea is perhaps H.Bomberguy is too successful. In about an hour and a half sprint, he gives the full history of the Souls series. He presents a snapshot of the typical Souls fan, and he reflects on the current state of the average game critic, and that's a lot to do. An hour and a half is a lot of time. That's still quite a lot to tackle. And I just kind of wanted to say H.Bomberguy put a massive amount of time, thought, and effort into this video, and he did the best that he could, reflecting on his thoughts and his feelings and his own player experiences. But ultimately, video games are extremely complicated, and when you scope this high, it gets even more complicated. So it's pretty clear to me that H.Bomberguy doesn't really have the language to break down things into clear, comparable parts and make really accurate comparisons. He doesn't really have something like the DO topic wheel, so all of his comparisons tend to have subtle misalignments, and he moves rapidly between topics trying to sort of outline, describe, or trace his player experience. And that's kind of a common thing that you see happen. And when you don't have everything broken down to categories, you oftentimes see players envision something that they went through or something they know another player went through and kind of describe what they are experiencing from that personal gameplay experience. But oftentimes when you're describing what's happening, you'll jump from enemy design, weapon design, level design, feedback design. You're just anything that comes into your immediate attention as you reflect on your experience, you'll say it out loud, and that makes for a very sort of clustered topic, a very sort of clustered conversation as you're trying to just narrow down a specific topics, specific elements, and isolate how those things affect the experience as a whole. You'll just most likely be jumping around. And I think pretty much the spectrum that I created, which I'll show you again, I think that this color banding you see pretty much reflects that exact idea. But if you think I'm being too harsh on H.Bomberguy, I just want you to just take a listen to what he's saying at the end of his own video.
The main reason I brought it up was because when I was reading reviews of Thumper to see what people thought about it, I found a review that called it the Dark Souls of rhythm games. I could say that calling something the Dark Souls of something, or saying something is like Dark Souls for the sake of comparison and easy clicks, is just poor and cliché writing, and it kind of is. But it's more that we as critics have a duty to communicate why something is good. Thumper has done a disservice by being described as the Dark Souls of rhythm games, because it indicates that we still don't have the language to really explain why something is good without having to compare it to a singular experience that isn't really all that much like it when you really get down to it. We as a community are sometimes unable to really come up with why we think something is good or we enjoy it, and it leaves us having to vaguely gesture in a game's direction because words have failed us. It's a hard series to pin down, I know, trust me, I've just spent a really long time trying to do so, because when we grapple with why we enjoy something, we're ultimately interrogating our own feelings, and that's a very difficult thing to do indeed. I think the onus is on us to try not to be willing to be long, complicated, willing to be, even a little bit boring or pedantic at times in order to explore the qualities of gaming experiences in a truly valuable way, which I hope I've done, but knowing me, I probably didn't.
So at the end of his video, he goes into quite an honest bit of self-reflection. He's commenting on how games are complicated, talking about games is really complicated, engaging your own feelings is complicated, and without the language to do so, people will most likely stumble in these common ways, in these ways that are familiar, even ways that perhaps he could even get around himself. And I think his honesty there is just kind of mirroring the same things I'm saying. But fortunately for us, we do have the language. We do have, a million words of game design worked out in all these different kinds of ways of looking at games. We have a glossary, we have a DO, color-coded topic wheel. We got everything we need to sort of sort out what's going on. So I just wanted to highlight a few examples of things that he said that he seemed to fall short, describing, explaining, articulating, whatever, and see where we can use the DO topic wheel in order to shed some light on the kinds of insights that he got so close to sort of encapsulating.
Okay, to start off, we're going to have to establish a baseline, aren't we? Bloodborne's amazing, but the Souls series has always been good. Let's start by talking in basic terms about the core gameplay. They are, when you boil it down, basically action games attempting to recreate the same sort of stuff RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons were designed to simulate. Adventures in magical lands with dungeons and/or dragons.
So yeah, that's a good opening. Pretty much from a general design perspective, saying that Bloodborne is an action RPG, therefore it's going to have a lot of actiony elements that you find in typical action games like Devil May Cry or Zelda, but it's really also going to have a lot of features, systems, rules, tropes that are more familiar to RPG players. So you're going to have stat tracking, you're going to have leveling up, you're going to have items, and that's why typically we call these games action RPGs. So trying to do a lot of the same things that RPGs do with their sense of world building and adventuring, but also instead of turn-based combat or anything like that, they give you a normal real-time action-based environment to play around in. So that makes a lot of sense. Moving on.
Immediate friction between you and what you want to achieve. You can't just hit the button when you see an opening, or dance around and wait until one gets handed to you. You have to learn to prepare and observe the timing of your enemy, and be able to know when to act instead of simply acting, or use your limited stamina resource to create an opening by dodging an early attack. This is the main reason why the series has always been a little bit divisive. Its deliberateness puts it directly at odds with almost every other game of its type, which strive to make actions as quick as possible and give the player tons of control and freedom.
Action games are pretty popular, pretty common. Even games like Super Mario Brothers they're action games, and even though you don't do a lot of combat, using the jumping on enemies, fighting bosses, you still combat things. It's all pretty much the same basic core elements of manipulating some kind of avatar through space and dodging in a way, exposing your opponent's weaknesses and moving around the environment. So that all that should be pretty familiar. We can use a lot of the same language to talk about all these games. So you don't necessarily need to compare Bloodborne to Devil May Cry or anything. You can just look at action games in general. So in this case, I think he makes a pretty big exaggeration, trying to draw a distinction between how Bloodborne plays, and mostly going by feel and sort of anecdotal experiences, because not every action game seeks to be sort of a fast-paced Devil May Cry style combat system with cancels and all that, as he outlines in his video. I mean, from Mario to Zelda to Devil May Cry to Bayonetta to even games like Dark Souls and Demon Souls, they all do things differently. So what we really need here is basically a way to analyze the game and break it down to very simple comparable parts, and sort of the little details about how fast your moves start up and all that just seem not very important in the long run, in the grand scheme of things, because when you're talking about combat, you're really talking about design space, because the combat itself and how the game plays on an emergent level, it's really a combination of all the mechanics you use, the environment around you, which includes level elements, enemy elements, which includes how they attack them, how they defend, their AI, all that, items, power-ups, upgrades, what items you have, what armor you have, what abilities you have that you might have acquired that aren't part of your standard set. It also involves somewhat understanding difficulty design and things like that, but that's why design space is sort of the emergent umbrella that sort of takes in all those other factors and elements into account. So already we're talking about a really complicated mix, and it doesn't really make sense to point out any small little bit on the wheel and be like, oh, the input in this one game is a hold rather than a tap or whatever, a shake rather than a tilt. That doesn't really make too much of a difference in the grand scheme of things, because combat requires you to use these around these to affect these in order to use some of this to get to here, the victory or whatever. So that's just a matter of understanding that not every topic that you talk about in game design has sort of a direct through line to the emergent final result. If you start on a small scope, you got to stay down there and just understand that it has limited effects depending on where you go next in your analysis. And if you start with something as large a scope as design space, you really have to understand all the asymmetrical ways these lower pieces may build up to a really good final product or a really not so good final product.
Knights in Demon Souls or the Black Knights in Dark Souls than basically every enemy in a Devil May Cry game put together. It's just that much more engaging. It makes every single encounter feel dense with prediction, timing, planning, and execution.
So yeah, right here, prediction, timing, execution, dexterity, and all that, we have a really clear way of talking about skill and difficulty design in video games. And instead of relying too much on terms that don't have really strong definitions, breaking it down objectively like this allows us to make comparisons between games. So, just off the top of my head and from my own personal experiences, Dark Souls in general isn't any different than how normal action games design their enemies. Limited AI, somewhat reactive, pros and cons based on their basic design, like a defensive enemy, ranged enemy, whatever, and various forms of attacks that have the attacks that give you enough time to react and defend or attack accordingly. So knowing that, it seems like he's making quite an exaggeration just to try to articulate what he feels is the difference between Dark Souls combat and other games that he doesn't seem to like so much. But just having a basic way of breaking it down would allow him to compare those things side by side and even measure things. Like I would like to know how many frames it takes general attacks to wind up and release across these various video games, instead of just relying on this general idea that Dark Souls has slow, weighty attacks, but that's not necessarily true compared to how slow and weighty the enemy's attacks are. So it's kind of all relative. There's many different ways to look at it, but starting with a strong structure like this, looking at the reflex, the dexterity requirements, the knowledge requirements, the timing requirements, that would be my best way to start.
Every sliver of health you take from someone's meter was earned through this delicate interplay. It's so good, writing about it required me to do the thing game critics should never do, and start using unfitting metaphors for food and/or sex. This stuff is hard to do well, and it really shows in games where it's done poorly. Weapons in Dark Souls are balanced so well that you don't even notice until this aspect is missing. But it isn't just these central principles of control that make the series fun. What's more interesting is how the world tests your ability to use these mechanics and thereby create the very specific feeling of adventure they do better than any other series.
So that's a really interesting point. He does recognize, as it's a pretty good thing, that the game's basic controls, the game's basic mechanics, the player actions are all designed. They're all designed a certain way. They all have a certain kind of balance in terms of damage and startup time and speed and all that. But beyond that, he says it doesn't really matter how much control you have. What really matters are how the challenges in the game stress your mechanics, your controls in a certain way, how they create different experiences and different challenges. And that's really a matter of level design. So he's really right in identifying that the basic pieces of a game may not be too interesting to talk about, or you may not be able to understand everything about why a game is good or bad by looking at the basic pieces. You have to look at how those pieces are built up in some of its more higher level structures. And level design is exactly that kind of higher level structure.
Let's take, for example, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a solid game. However, a couple of things irk me about it. One is how there's this constant need to explain itself to you. Every new concept or creature or enemy in the game is explained to you carefully and in an easily digestible manner. When Stalfos spawn to attack you, they appear at a safe distance and then jump away. When a trap is introduced, it's shown to you in a way where you immediately know its entire path and what it does and so on. The game loves to tell you in straightforward ways how it works or what's happening and let you deal with it how you want. This is, fine, and I guess it's a masterpiece that I've loved my whole life. It's very fair on the player.
So here is where we get to a lot of the really subtle language that I really want to focus on for this video. He essentially describes what most of us consider to be good game design. And he describes Zelda in a way where enemies come up and you have time to react to them. He describes Zelda in a way where there are traps and obstacles in an environment and you have time to study them, plan around them, and play inside of the challenge in various ways, but after acquiring the knowledge from a relatively safe entry point. And he describes all these ways that Zelda's designed Ocarina of Time, but basically the Nintendo way of designing games. He has a little bit of a disappointing tone, and he says like, oh, it's good, it's fine, you know, I liked it before, but not now that I'm older. And he describes the whole thing as being fair. When he puts these two concepts in an analogy where like Zelda Nintendo style games is fair as Dark Souls is to, and I think the word he's going to say, which fits that analogy, is raw.
Deliberateness, such a test of perception and prediction of a raw mechanical input, or prediction of a raw mechanical input, raw.
And the contrast between fair and raw is really what the heart of, it's really a complex conversation, a really complex topic that requires a lot of game design knowledge and sort of language in order to tease out. But I'm going to point out a few other things he says, and we'll see if he walks that line carefully.
But what I don't like about fairness is how it impacts the sense that you're supposed to be on an adventure. Link is trying to save the world by journeying into the heart of darkness and delivering the temples from evil. So why are the enemies taking the time to introduce themselves? And why are the traps making sure you know where they are and what they do? Evil is playing fair and always being careful to show me its weak point. Nothing is ever quite surprising in Zelda.
Then he takes this idea that because these are supposed to be adventure games, that it doesn't make sense for them to be fair. And I think there's a whole bunch of concepts that are conflated all inside of this sort of this cluster of words here. If you associate fair game design with sort of classic Nintendo and good game design, then you look at it raw and you're like, well, what does raw give you? He just now started to build this analogy that raw gives you, quote unquote, the sense of a real adventure, real dangers, real peril. And what you'll see later is that he starts to conflate the idea of a raw gameplay experience with something that is more realistic and something that gives you, quote unquote, actual danger and by contrast, actual real feelings of success. And this is a really weird way of understanding the opposite style of design from good design. So good design seeks to create these really detailed game worlds and empower the player by allowing the player to exist in a fair way and tackle these challenges. So like no random elements, no gotcha moments, no changing the rules invisibly behind the scene just for the purpose of like shock value or just shaking things up. The consistency at which these games are build a set of consistent interactions and knowledge that the player builds on over time and uses that skill, which is knowledge skill. I'll show you on the wheel. And having a consistent world just means players can stress more and more their knowledge skill, which means they can analyze things better and use more long-term memory that doesn't have to be updated. They can learn something once and have that knowledge be persistent and useful throughout the entire experience. And they can use a whole wide variety of other subfacets of knowledge skill in order to play better, because knowledge feeds your ability to do dexterous actions in the controller. Knowledge feeds your ability to tune out and prune what stimuli you react to for your reflexes. Knowledge helps you understand the various complex timings inside of a game space and all of that. So like knowledge is incredibly important. Building game systems with consistent rules is incredibly important for building that knowledge. The potential for the player to embrace knowledge and use skill in a much wider fashion and variety, but also feedback and presenting the game information in such a clear way helps you build that knowledge to then help you build that skill in order for the game to have that variety. So this is why all these different topics in the design wheel are really important. This is why it's really important to have a language in order to see where that logical chain of influences are for each individual element. And this is something that without it, you're just grasping at straws and trying to define adventure as something that is realistic and something that kills you. And that really has nothing to do with the variety of ways that you can engage in these experiences. So I'll click on the next clip so you can better understand what I'm talking about.
Maybe for some types of games, fairness isn't actually a good thing. In making itself too clear about what's happening and how it works, it's probably more intuitive and playable, but it causes it to lack a truly great dimension of feeling like you're fighting against unknowable odds instead of being told them all the time.
So again, this isn't the first time that we've heard players react negatively to clearly presented information, fair challenges, and even tutorials. I mean, that is just one of the common talking points, if you will, for the Zelda series, and how they tell you too much and they tell you how to do things, and Navi and Fia are annoying or whatever. I don't think they're annoying, and I think they actually don't tell you that much at all. And if you just look at the way that people get stuck in these games, and you look at the wide variety of ways to approach its challenges and different ways to express your play styles, then you know that there's way too much in the game for the game to ever tell you how to do something, even if they're giving you some pretty effective hints when you get stuck. It's just interesting how people often conflate this idea of, well, in real life is hard, and real life doesn't fit together in a nice bow. Real life things don't work together nicely for me, and then they conflate all those kinds of perceptions of real life into this idea of what is realistic or raw, and then they also think that that's a good thing for video games. And I think it's quite the opposite. Real life is about as raw as it gets, right? But if you ever just want to do something that's skill-based or worthwhile, like pick any hobby, like playing piano, back there, piano, can you see it? There's a piano. But anyway, if you want to do something like that and you play piano, you could sit there and try to teach yourself how to play really masterful, beautiful, high-level piano all by yourself. It's going to be incredibly hard. You are going to be guessing and checking. You're going to be grasping at straws. You're going to be trying stuff out and seeing if it sounds good, and you're really going to have no guidance. But and that's about as raw as it gets for trying to teach yourself a highly skilled activity and engaging with something that's really complex on your own. So just like that super raw, real life also comes with a lot of guidance, teachers, instruction booklets, tools, software, suggestions, advice, encouragement, all these things that help you learn better and understand what music is and what playing the piano is better. And you can go as far up that scale as possible to where you have multiple teachers, you have multiple environments that are really structured and help you learn better. And we all know that you learn better when you have a teacher. Like, that is no question. There are almost nobody out there that can play well without having some kind of teacher, or mentor, guide, or whatever. So that's just not even up for debate. What I bring all that up to say that real life is also highly structured. And if the thing you want to get out of real life is embracing complexity, having really skill-based hobbies, being really talented in an area, being able to execute or do something well, and through that understand these things better, then I just don't understand why so many people have so many issues with guidance and tutorials and any kind of teaching structure in games. I mean, H.Bomberguy goes as far as to say that he doesn't even like how the game presents information clearly. Well, then what else is there? Do you really want to go back to the place where you have no help, no guidance, and you're just guessing and checking? Because that's really all you can do in absence of quality learning experiences. You guess, you check, and if you have enough stamina to do that for a long period of time, you may eventually come out on the other end successful, but at what cost, right? Even in a highly structured, highly guided, highly educational environment, there is still plenty of room to be lost, plenty of room to think you know something and have that knowledge come up short, plenty of room to fail in so many ways that there's no reason to explicitly take away the sort of structure and the fairness and the guidance built into the structure, because you will fail anyway. You will misunderstand things, and that will send you into directions that will ultimately lead you away from the goal that you're supposedly trying to reach. So as far as benefits, the pros and cons, you can make an incredibly fair, consistent, deterministic system and still have all the same kinds of ups and downs and challenges and difficulty and room for the players to express themselves and find their own way to learn and everything as you would with a system that has no guidance. So I don't see any actual benefit from designing quote-unquote raw game experiences to the extent that they they directly go against the main reason why people are in that experience in the first place. But don't just take my word for it. I may have my own reasons for playing Bloodborne, but let's just see what H.Bomber considers to be the quality aspects of playing this game.
Something really weirdly sanitized about Zelda games. What makes the world of any given Souls game so much more interesting is that it doesn't play fair. Take for example mimics in Dark Souls. The only way of learning that there are enemies in the game who look like chests and eat you to death if you try to open them is to find one and try to open it and die. This isn't bad design though, like, oh how dare they not give me the chance to not die there. It's good design. Because they've quote-unquote unfairly sacrificed the player's life that one time, they've thoroughly instilled a sense of paranoia and awareness and given you an even greater sense of having the odds stacked against you in a horrible world full of murder and death. It's not that the game is unfair to players, it's that the world itself is unfair to people. Life is unfair in the world of Dark Souls, and you learn that the hard way by dying in it. And once you make it past a difficult area, beat a hard boss, or successfully predict that a chest is a mimic and destroy it, you'll feel like you've gained ground against a genuinely dangerous world.
The fact, I think what he articulates really well in this video is that the game is unfair, and though he calls it a good thing, it's not a good thing. But the reason why he thinks it's so interesting is because when you actually don't fall for the unfairness, let's say it's just a random element, like you could randomly die when you open this chest, you can randomly not, that when you successfully guess right, that you feel like you've overcome something that is quote unquote genuinely hard, which means he's sort of ascribing a quality to that experience of being hard in a realistic way instead of a way that's sort of guided and structured and a way that tests your knowledge skill and allows you to embrace the skill spectrum of a game. And if you really contrast these two experiences, one is just random. If you have no control over it, if you have no way to know about it, if you have no practical way to leverage your knowledge and your skill and your dexterity and your timing and all that to overcome the challenge most of the time, then what we're really saying is you're just inside of a random death trap. And sure, everybody can memorize where the traps are if they trial and error their way through it and die enough times. But I'm saying that is not a quality experience, because it's really not you that overcomes it if it's truly not skill-based, right? Guessing right is not truly part of what makes you tick. It's just maybe sometimes you said heads and the coin flipped heads. Maybe sometimes you stumbled across something on accident. But as far as the range of expression that you can have when it's actually your own skill, it's like an entire world on the fair skill-based end, and for not skill-based, it's this tiny sliver that just says, did you guess right? And I don't think those two are valid things to compare. I think we all understand the effects of randomness. I wrote an article about it, actually. I'll show you. Yeah, so 2010, I wrote an article on my blog, and this is a hard copy of it, but you can kind of see here. It says random knowledge quirks. And I just talk about all the different sort of ways that people psychologically react to randomness. And this is something that's been studied all over the place. So you don't even have to take this article's word for it. I cite a few things, and I quote this Sid Meier, who had a GDC talk in 2010, but he says, any kind of randomness needs to be treated with a lot of care. Whenever something random happens to the player, paranoia sets in. Paranoia is the same word that H.Bomberguy uses. The player feels like the computer rolled the random number just to be difficult, right? So I talk about all these different ways that players tend to read into randomness with very sort of human-like reactions. Like they think the computer has a personality quirk when something randomly didn't go their way. They think the life is being unfair. Sometimes they think the randomness has a bias when it doesn't, just because of the way that they're taking a selective sample of the results instead of like the bigger picture. When luck happens in their favor, people tend to like randomness better, but when it's out of their favor, they tend to blame the computer. So they take ownership over the skill of being lucky, but then they blame everyone else for the unfortunateness of being unlucky. So there's a lot of different ways that people react to randomness, and that's kind of crazy. And when you're talking about unskilled, quote unquote, unfair situations, we're really just talking about another type of randomness. And you see a lot of the same patterns, a lot of same human reactions to it. And that's why I think these quotes from H.Bomberguy are so interesting. He's going to use a lot of words like genuine. He's going to use a lot of words like actual to try to convey this idea that embracing the randomness has more to it than it does, but it doesn't. So let's continue to listen.
The Souls games don't always play fair, but that makes besting them feel all the sweeter. Like a genuine victory, you know? And that feeling is worth getting killed unfairly a couple of times, because it creates the sense of there being great odds to beat. The feeling of triumphing against adversity is increased when that adversity has already actually killed you at least once.
In response to things like that, you're going to die in normal video games. You don't need them to be unfair to die in video games. Everyone understands that truly skill-based challenges, you have to work hard to get that skill and then overcome it. And that's really what makes video games so compelling for just about every kind of skill-based game out there. So you don't need to be unfairly killed to generate that experience. You just need to have the game experience reflectly, have a high enough skill barrier, and then have your progress up to that point be accurately and consistently reflected. And that's why this really doesn't make a lot of sense.
Those games get into you, like inside your head, and all the gesticulating about crazy difficulty melts away in the face of a fun, unforgiving, but enriching series of encounters that test you in ways games rarely manage to do, an almost internal level. You stop doing the maths about how quickly your attack goes off and trying to figure out an opening to move, and you start to just know the right time, because all this stuff is so deep in your head that you don't even have to think about it. It becomes like an instinct.
So video games being skill-based and requiring you to learn and execute and all those things based on the Descartes spectrum, the act of building your own skill is taking that game and all of its complexity and all of its knowledge and putting it inside your head so that you pretty much have a working model of how the game works, which allows you to make better predictions and make more informed decisions and play better. So there's nothing about Dark Souls or the Souls series that makes it get in your head. That's just what video games do. That's called skill-based gameplay experiences. Nothing special, and it's neat. I mean, everybody loves that quality about games. But here's also what's interesting about what he said. He contrasts this idea that, oh, the game needs to be genuine and have real challenges in a way that's unfair to give you the sense of real challenge. But ultimately, real challenge is better expressed through fair, consistent, skill-based gameplay experiences. So the thing he's trying to say is so good about Bloodborne and other Souls games, it's the same thing that's good about other games. But then the way he's trying to say that it's good in Bloodborne, the rawness, the randomness, the unfairness, that's the precise thing that is getting in the way of Bloodborne being good in the same way that he's describing, in the same way that other games do. And that's an awful sort of twist. The thing that's actually holding you back, you think it's the thing that's making it good. But when you break things down, you can clearly see there's something a little bit more complex that's happening.
And there is a right way to play the Souls games. You can hide behind the shield a lot, die over and over trying to memorize every encounter, or use magic from a distance to avoid having to engage with the game, or wear the heaviest armor and hope that'll save you. But the reality is, it's just more fun playing it as someone who dodges, who weaves, who parries, and who uses situational awareness to assess a situation and maybe get out of it the first time without so much trial or error. It's not that hard. The Souls games aren't really all that difficult. You dodge the attack, and then you hit them with the stick. Done. I just solved all the Souls games for you. Everything else is just pretentiousness about preparing to die and all that stupid. Ignore all of that.
And again, he describes one of the harder to obtain, one of the more rare gameplay experiences, but one that he puts a lot of value in. He says, you know what? If you play this game the right way, you don't have to turtle up. You don't have to cheese enemies from afar. You can get in there and attack. And if you are playing on your toes, you can dodge things without dying the first time in your boss. You can actually get around attacks even though it's the first time you've encountered them or the second time or whatever. And you can actually take down these challenges with skill. So if he's saying the good part about Bloodborne and Souls games and the right way to play it means treating them like a skill-based game, then it makes less sense to ascribe all the qualities that fair skill-based games create, all the types of experiences they create, and try to claim that those kinds of things come from raw gameplay design, which includes randomness, unclear feedback, and so many other things. I'll show you right here. So this is the third volume of my printed blog, and I wrote an article. I mentioned it before in one of these design over time videos, but this third article is raw game design. And this article, I talked about what raw game design is, and it's a general concept, but it just means that there's a significant lacking element within a game due to various design parts. But this lacking element means that the game is really hard to communicate what's happening. Like it feels like it doesn't even know what it's trying to convey. Maybe the camera's too bad, or maybe the other elements of the feedback just aren't clear at all. And when emergent issues start happening, like there's a lack of feedback, there's a lack, or the gameplay is easily stalled into infinity. When there's resets in a game, but they don't actually reset the advantages of the parties involved. When matches end too quickly. When only certain moves in the core design space are viable, when the basic actions are too difficult to execute in a game. And I think the most important one for this discussion is right there. When a game has a lack of interplay system. So that's ultimately meaning when the challenges in a game are designed to where it doesn't seem like you can get a decent advantage for how your player mechanics are designed, what options you have available, whatever. It could just be like a situational thing or a game-wide thing, but it doesn't matter. When it feels like you can't really get good advantages and there's no opportunities to leverage your skills in a way that keeps you safe and actually allows you to win, then that's just kind of another way of saying, even though the game's trying to be skill-based, it's actually not quite there. To the point where actual outcome of the match, no matter how much skill you have, could still be quite random, quite unfair, not enough in your favor. There's many different ways to analyze exactly how that happens.
Your health back from the guy who hit you. Bloody blimey! Like, now you always have the option of being a little more vicious and getting away with it. It's hugely impactful on the flow and action of combat. Combined with the loss of shields, you're carefully encouraged into a mindset that's just more aggressive and tactile and fun, and more big, fun-sounding words.
He's making an interesting case for why having no shield in Bloodborne actually encourages players to play in a way that's more fun for most players. So that's a really cool argument. It's a really cool theory. But you can see he doesn't really have the language to articulate much more about how that happens and what it actually changes in the gameplay battle dynamics. So he just kind of fumbles around with a few words for right there, and it's kind of funny.
It's not even a huge difference, is it? But it results in an improved approach to combat that's more satisfying for players and which, like not using a shield, carries back over to the previous games. The enemies are repetitive, there's no boss fights, even quick attacks feel slow, like in Lords of the Fallen, and more importantly, the lack of design in any of the levels or environments means there's no character or feel to the world. It's the Chalice dungeons, but without the upshot of being attached to an actually good game. I guess what I'm saying is I like games when they're designed by people.
And right here he makes an interesting contrast between just having the raw elements thrown into a game experience and having those elements crafted into something that's, more focused, more designed, more intentional, more deliberate. There's many words to describe it, but in essence, he's right here highlighting the fact that just having these different elements and bits in your game isn't enough. You actually have to create a gameplay experience that's tailored for something more interesting than the basic interactions. And he says here that level design is a really important thing apparently for Bloodborne. The challenge dungeons don't really measure up to the main game whatsoever because they're just random and they seem to lack thought and they lack progression, right? They lack development, and enemies just seem to be randomly placed, and that's just not good enough.
Dungeons make a lot of points for me about the importance of level design and execution in these games and show how the base mechanics alone wouldn't be enough for an engaging and fun experience. You need the push and pull of a designer hiding enemies in just the right places, scaling the difficulty of encounters through careful development of enemy placement and so on.
So what's interesting about that entire argument is, even though he contrasted earlier in the video that Zelda is quote-unquote designed to be fair and they set things up for you to see it ahead of time and they teach you what's up and then they allow you to play within it, it seems like later in his own video he's saying the same thing, relatively the same thing about Bloodborne. It's not just about being random, unfocused, unfair, and randomness and rawness go together pretty well. They're kind of a one leads into the other, so it's not too much of a stretch to see how randomness can create a more raw, quote-unquote unfair, unskill-based gameplay experience. So it's interesting how he contrasts the fact that Zelda is designed intentional and set up for you to win and have fun and be informed. And then he's saying, you know what Bloodborne needs? Non-randomly arranged enemies, non-randomly arranged hallways. It needs to be designed. It needs to be intentional. It needs to have somebody who can see how the player is going to approach these situations and ramp up the difficulty and down and hide things. I'm like, yeah, it's called design. And you don't really get that when your system has a lot of rawness in it. And I think designed versus rawness is a really good way of expressing that contrast of exactly what I'm talking about here. I think if you just listen to the language that he uses, and you listen to the way he makes his arguments, and you listen to the way that he pretty much contradicts himself in tiny little ways here and there when he's trying to draw contrasting comparisons across so many different games, across Zelda, across Bloodborne, across Demon Souls, across Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2 even. The through line, the consistent elements are something that are better understood when you're able to break things down using the Descartes wheel, using more precise language. And this it's not just about saying it out loud. It's about when you recognize that all these parts are distinct and how they connect together and what they mean and how they build up. That kind of structure, that framework is in your head. And you use it to better see the games in front of you, play the games in front of you, and then compare the games in your mind. So it's just sort of a positive feedback loop. And the more you dig into this, the more that it'll just help the entire process. So that you won't be struggling so hard when you're trying to confront your own feelings. You'll actually say, like, actually, I found exactly the point of which I like this experience and why I don't like this experience. And this is exactly what I like most about games. And even though other people like this most, this is what I like, therefore this whole game experience isn't enough. You can articulate yourself without calling everything the Dark Souls or whatever, or without making all these crazy exaggerated comparisons. And from there, you have all the power to you. Not only the power to play games better, but the power to talk about them better, and it just pays it forward from there. So that's all I really want to say about this video. You should go and watch H.Bomberguy's full video. It's an hour and a half. Listen to it like a podcast. The visuals are great. He actually does find a lot of good footage for everything he talks about. But if you don't have the time, you can always double the speed on YouTube. I find that works pretty well. But go ahead and pay him a visit and leave a comment on his video if you like it. And also, if you have any questions for me, leave them down in the comments below or get to me on Twitter. Our Twitter is @designoriented, or you can follow me on Twitter @KirbyKid. But I answer lots of questions like this, and we will be going over a lot more information about raw game design and all the tiny little ways that it can come up and how it affects games in general. What are the pros of it, and can we have raw game design without necessarily having random elements? And so much to talk about, but I just wanted to bring up this interesting video and share that with you on this last episode for the week. So, and until next week, this has been Design Over Time. Later.